Hi, I'm Jeff Johnston, host of the Living Undeterred podcast. This is a reminder that we're going on tour next summer. Yes, that's right, we're going on tour. The Living Undeterred US Tour 2022. We're leaving on May 9th next summer. We're going to every state and we're raising $1 million. That's the plan to change the narrative on mental health, substance abuse, and addiction. We need your help, though. I cannot do this alone. I know there's a lot of people out there interested in this project of ours. You can go to our website, www.livingundeterred.com. We need volunteers. We need state partnerships. We need sponsors. We need as many people as we can to get out there and help those people that need help to change the narrative on mental health, substance abuse, and addiction. Again, go to livingundeterred.com and click on the Living Undeterred icon, and all the information is there. Again, thank you very much for the support, and as always, keep living undeterred.
Hello, this is Jeff Johnston, host of the Living Undeterred Project, and welcome to what I am going to admit up front I'm slightly nervous about. I've talked to a lot of people in the last year, and this particular guest I am super stoked because I'm stepping outside of my comfort zone. I'm stepping outside of some of the boundaries that I've limited to myself. And I'm very excited to have a conversation with my guest today, Jonathan DePotter. He is the founder, the CEO of Behold Retreats, which we're going to talk a lot about what he does. And I know a lot of you watching the show today and maybe seeing the title of the show may be a little confused. But let me explain to you something about what the Living Undeterred Project is all about. For those of you following my story, we lost our lovely son, Seth, October 4th, 2016, to a heroin overdose. And I lost my wife of 21 years, approximately 5 months ago, to trauma and grief, but specifically to alcohol abuse. And this is the first time publicly I've actually said that. But I do think I owe it to her to make sure that we learn from this. We try not to make those mistakes. And I am all about learning, education, and inspiration. And my guest today is going to talk about all three of these. He's also very active in, or maybe taking a different approach to what he's involved with in working with entrepreneurs, leaders, and CEOs. So I thought it's funny, Jonathan, I'll throw this out, that you go by the psychedelic CEO. So that's the first thing that attracted me to your story. I think I saw you on LinkedIn, and I thought, I've always wanted to have somebody on the show from the psychedelic angle, because there's two areas of grief and mental health that really have me interested in that I have zero experience in. So I'm not your normal host here that's going to talk to you about things I'm an expert in. I'm just a dad from Iowa that's very passionate about these things. But it's brainwave pattern research and psychedelics. Those are two areas that really have me excited about how we can change the narrative of mental health, substance abuse, and addiction. So with that, here's our guest, Jonathan D. Potter from Thailand, and I'm honored to be talking to you today. So let's maybe talk a little bit about what expectations are for the show today and how you and I think we can start navigating through this exciting topic.
Beautiful. Well, you've set me up so brilliantly there, Jeff. So thank you. And I think we'll have a lot of fertile ground to cover. And my deep condolences for your losses. And like so many of your listeners, heart really goes out to you. So I think there's a couple of dynamics that I think are of interest in relation to this subject. So I think first and foremost, a distinction that I like to draw is between what we have set as the bar for mental health, which is a subjective level, which is a reflection of population sickness, actually, rather than population health. And so we can talk a little bit about that. The other dynamic that I think is important in relation to this is the deep spiritual aspect of this work. Right. And I myself went into my first experience as an atheist, very much a Newtonian and material worldview, and so was very surprised when these doors were opened. And then in relation to that is in kind of ties back to what you just mentioned there in terms of brainwaves and grief and trauma is vibration and consciousness, right? So as we progress through this work and we harmonize more of our subconscious and are able to release some of those lower level things that are not what we are, so the grief, the fear, the apathy, the anger, the shame, the guilt, all of those lower level emotions that are trapped in our physical body, then we are able to access higher state vibrations. And through these, experiences in these higher states, we come to recognize that indeed it's all just energy, and it's and so our understanding of the relationship between our inner world and our outer world changes very dramatically, and our understanding of what we are as individuals and our role within the collective universe can be fundamentally shifted through these experiences. And then, of course, our work is to integrate these very powerful and transformational experiences to improve the quality of everyday life, and ultimately to begin to move towards these levels of consciousness on a sustainable basis, rather than just in an expanded state on, say, a plant medicine psychedelic retreat. So there's a few different ideas in terms of directions we may take it from here.
Yeah, I think when I was doing some research and background on your story, I come from the lens of being fairly naive on this topic. I think I told you when we talked before the show, I have never done drugs. I have never done psychedelics. I think I smoked pot once in college, but I was drunk, and I think I don't remember the experience as being a good one. I've always felt I had drugs in my body. And when I was in high school, Len Bias, who was a tremendous basketball player, tried cocaine on the night he signed his multi-million-dollar contract to the NBA, and he died. And that always had me worried that, I was more concerned with I would like drugs too much, and with an addictive ADD or attention deficit. I hate the word disorder. Attention deficit is no disorder. It's a superpower. Trust me. I was always worried I would get addicted and couldn't quit. And so that was my stigma with psychedelics and that stuff. And then with the war on drugs coming, research on this area kind of got set aside, and now we're seeing a resurgence or a renaissance in plant medicine, we'll call it, which I like that better than psychedelics, to be honest with you. I think there's so much stigma with this that word that I think it scares a lot of people. So after Seth died, I thought, what I can do justice is not go out there and try to be that angry dad, but be a dad on a passionate mission about learning. And you talked about an atheist. I'm an agnostic. I write about it constantly in my writings, my blogs. And I think atheist for me is a tough word, because to me it implies that I know something, like I know there isn't a God. And I don't think I'm ready to say that, but I'm certainly comfortable saying that I don't know. So I think that's where the agnosticism comes into me. When I look at psychedelics, if I were to go on a trip, which I really believe is the spiritual of it is very exciting to me, very, very exciting to me. Not from a seeing God or a celestial entity I'm going to meet, but from an inner you talked about vibrations. I love that word that you use for this inner consciousness, or this maybe inner outer consciousness that we have, that we're trying to get to another level. Because I told you on the show that we are the most unhappy, most hurting society as humans than we've probably ever been. And abundance, we should have access to more information. Just look at the states here. Look at the obesity rates, and we know what's on everything. Everything we eat, we put in our mouth, it tells us how bad it is. So where do you see this bridge from well-being and peace versus, or the other side of the bridge of where we are with the land of abundance and we're just miserable? Where do you see us tapping into this wisdom to become, happier, better?
Yeah, and I think it all relates back to our level of consciousness. So the way that I typically articulate this to our clients is that, to oversimplify, I talk about consciousness in 4 broad bands. So the bottom can be typically identified as inaction. So when people are depressed, right? So they're kind of stuck because of the lower level emotions like the shame, the guilt, and the fear.
Right.
And so they feel like they're being victimized by life itself, right?
Right.
Then above that, we would have what I would describe as the hyperactive levels of consciousness. And so, that's where most people who are productive in everyday society are today. So that's really living from the emotions of pride, anger, and envy, right? So these are the kind of predominant emotional states. And what we tend to see from people there is very busy. These are the very busy people are in these kind of hyperactive states of consciousness. Above that is what I would describe as more kind of interdependent and collaborative. So these are the states where we are, I guess, more willing to adjust our point of view in order for the collective good, and there tends to be an increase in terms of our willingness to relinquish control to a great degree, and then above that is what I would describe as the mystical states of consciousness. So that's when the things like rationality and debate and differences no longer hold any relevance, because we understand that love is fundamentally the single unifying force of the universe, and that really nothing else matters. And so, when we talk about this, if you look at the predominant narrative in relation to psychedelics and plant medicine today, what you'll see is that most of the conversation predominantly is oriented around the lower levels of consciousness. So we're talking about treatment for depression, anxiety, PTSD, and don't get me wrong, like those are all very important subjects. Those are, to put it in financial terms, those are massive markets, because as you say, we've got all sorts of diseases of abundance and people are suffering, and we don't want people to suffer. But it's a bit limited in the sense that it's not talking about our opportunity to thrive. So we're just trying to root out the minimum amount of errors so that we can get people back up to a operational state so that they continue to work hard in whatever it is that they're doing, versus getting people to really high levels of consciousness and really thriving to their utmost potential. And so I think part of the reason for that being the case is that it's actually easier to go from bad to better than it is to go from good to great. So, the example I sometimes give is look at any psychedelic community or psychedelic society. What you will often find is that these are people who perhaps aren't doing so good themselves, right? So still living in scarcity, relationships are a disaster, walk into their homes, it's still a mess. Maybe they're not doing things that they like in terms of jobs. So it's not that psychedelics are in of themselves, are positive, they're neutral. It's how we use them. It's the context in which we enter this type of work that is so fundamentally important. And so when coming back to your question, in relation to how do we facilitate that evolution? Well, I think unfortunately we're at a juncture where there is such a heightened degree of interest in relation to the subject, with unfortunately not sufficient high quality supply of expertise and guidance and coaches and facilitators to be able to guide people on the most transformational experiences that are possible through this work. So I think unfortunately it will be a bit of trial and error. I certainly see that the Western medical model is not necessarily in the highest interest of this work, but of course that is what's being pursued because that's the paradigm that is in place. But ultimately we will gravitate. I think we will gravitate. I tend to be not too judgmental in relation to this. We, like human beings always do, we will gravitate towards the things that work and the things that work best over time. And so while we see a bunch of commercial interests trying to rebrand, addictive substances like ketamine as psychedelic or MDMA as psychedelic, don't get me wrong, they have their place. They're fundamentally not psychedelics. Then we will bump into one another. We will trip over ourselves and one another a little bit, but we will get there, as I think we always do. But I think it's going to be it's going to be a pivotal point in terms of how this subject is released and how well we care for one another and educate one another through that process, so that we're able to get the most out of these powerful substances.
Yeah, I have so much to say about what you just said, and I got to thinking about when I first started the Living Undeterred project after This One's for You, an inspirational journey through addiction, death, and meaning. very interested in many angles of this aspect. Obviously, the stigma with what you're kind of up against. You talk about Western medicine and so forth. From my perspective, get the pharmaceutical industry. Especially being injected into seems like so many different things. I originally thought that I was going to go after big pharma, go after the drug cartels. That was my supply side mind working, Jonathan. Mm-hmm. That to change the narrative, I was going to focus on where this is coming from. But the reality is, it's coming from us. It's coming from the demand side. My son and my wife made conscious or possibly subconscious choices to go down those roads when those other roads were there. They just chose not to take them. So part of my mission, certainly I'm trying to get big pharma to, spend more time and emphasis, which, obviously there's a lot of companies now that are taking some pretty big hits on the stock side, on the media side, which is good. We need to reshape the industry. I'm not anti-drugs at all. My dad's a retired doctor, so I obviously have some skin in the game from that aspect. But I noticed something when you were doing an interview. You talked about CEOs in particular, Jonathan, which again piqued my interest when I met your story about releasing. And I wrote that down as a quote that you said in an interview that I thought that when CEOs can release fear, they become better leaders. So now my CEO hat here and not my dad hat. And talk a little bit about CEOs and leaders and entrepreneurs and how possibly this psychedelic angle, another tool in the toolbox or another arrow in the quiver to make them better leaders and better people.
Yeah, one of the ways I like to contextualize this one a little bit is I don't know if you've read Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers.
Yes, I have. Yep.
In the first chapter of that book, you'll remember that he talks about NHL players and them all being born basically within a 3-month window.
Right.
And the reason for that was because they're more physically developed. The ones that are almost 5 are much more physically developed than the ones that just turned 4. And that cycle perpetuates itself into the big leagues. And so we find in the NHL, everyone's born within this 3-month window.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, this is a little bit the same dynamic that's playing out in relation to the people who are in leadership positions around the world. So the question is, what is it that unites the people who are driven towards the most success in the external world? And I believe the answer to that question is they are the most traumatized. And the reason I believe that is because I was very much on that path myself ahead of discovering, ayahuasca and working with plant medicine and a lot of the mental and emotional work that followed. And so these are a group of people who, to a great degree, they have been removed from themselves emotionally, usually through childhood trauma or perhaps intergenerational trauma. And so as a result of that, they actually require external validation to feel good enough. Absolutely. And so that becomes a cycle that perpetuates itself. It starts in school, right? You get the highest grades, you get the pat on the back, and that begins the cycle of hyper competitiveness, win at all costs. And those are the people who are going to make it to, the best universities. Those are the people who are going to make it into the consulting, the banking, the finance, the trading jobs. Those are the people who are going to make it into the big tech companies. And then it just goes from there.
Yep.
And so that's what when we talk about, world leaders and CEOs and people who are in those positions, they have so deeply overwhelmed their stress systems, right? Because they're just so used to being in a state of constant overwhelm. Now, and managing such a high degree of complexity. Now, when that takes place, number one, the physiology is shot in terms of our nervous system, but equally it begins to do damage to the very software of our brain. So what tends to happen is because we are just overwhelmed and stressed, is that there's so much complexity to manage in everyday life that the brain begins to take shortcuts in its thinking. It begins to respond to patterns rather than to actual stimulus. Right. And while that sounds like a positive adaptive response, what it actually means is that the brain is becoming deterministic. So you're actually losing your neuroplasticity in relation to that. And I think we can all see it, people who've been in big management positions positions, they can all see it within themselves in terms of where they become very patterned because they've seen so many patterns, right? I think a great amount of management and leadership is about pattern recognition and being able to apply the right treatment to patterns that you've seen over and over again. And then, when it comes to consulting or leadership in general, you're also rewarded for your ability to predict potential future negative outcomes, if I may frame it that way.
Yep.
Right. So your brain is constantly in this mode of looking for, lions in the grass out in the distance.
Right.
So then bringing that back to, releasing fear. So, a lot of the programming on a societal basis is scarcity, right? So we are chasing after big numbers, and we're chasing after all of these things that from the outside that we hope can give us the security that we want to feel, but it's still not there, right? If you look at, I'm just going to pick on him because he's been in the news a lot recently, but if you look at Elon Musk's face, that doesn't look to me as someone who's found great contentment and security within. So it's not that outside abundance is going to give him that. It has to come from within. And so if we look at any of the dysfunction that's materializing in the outside world, it's always a reflection of what's going on in the inside world, very much as you described in terms of what happens or how you see what played out for your family. And so what is available through these experiences is typically there's patterns. There's two patterns that fundamentally emerge. One is in relation to empathy, and the second is in relation to courage. So first and foremost, empathy for ourselves, right? So there's a lot of healing work typically to be done through being introduced to plant medicine, and that's releasing a lot of the lower level emotions and also regaining our neuroplasticity, right? So as these medicines facilitate the growth of new neurons, so that means that our brain is being reconnected in ways that it hasn't been, often for decades or even since we were children. And so that can actually give us access to painful memories and experiences that we've actually compartmentalized away from everyday waking consciousness. And so as these, painful earlier life experiences are being reintegrated, we actually have the opportunity to process them and ultimately release them. And we will, through that, we see how those things are manifesting in our everyday character. So it could be anger, it could be impatience, it could be, any number of character traits, often even unexplained character traits that we can feel being released alongside some of these, earlier traumatic experiences. So developing that empathy for ourselves first and foremost, and healing ourselves, which then allows us to also extend that more broadly out to others. And then the second is really courage, right? So once we lose that fear, once we've released that fear in relation to us individually not being enough or there not being enough. So once we drop the belief in the scarcity mindset, then we're able to pursue things that are much more aligned to our unique gifts and strengths. I think it's through our pain and through our own story and the pain that is inherent within that story and the suffering, that is where our superhuman skills and strengths lie. And that's where our gifts lie that we have to bring and to give out into this world. And I think we are just at an incredibly exciting point because so many more thousands and millions of people are putting down their jobs of cranking out widgets in companies and dedicating their lives to helping others because they've come through a path of growth and healing. And so they're very motivated to help others in that regard. So we're actually moving to a place where we're focused on the collective elevation of consciousness, which is super, super exciting.
That's exactly what happened to me, Jonathan. I started my company at 23, worked 100 hours a week, slept in my car, no computer, basically sold intangible concepts to people door to door. You're not selling a car or a house, I'm selling retirement, and build up a company at 50, was on top of the world. And then my son dies and I watch my marriage start falling apart and watch and I just said, you know what, I have evolved, and that I think I like to talk to people about is let's don't be survivors, solvers. Let's shed our skin. Horace said non sum qualis eram, and he talked about I am not what I was or something to that effect. And that is so. I'm not the same Jeff Johnson I was 5 years ago. I'm a new person. I have most of the same everything in me, but I'm not the same person. I'm completely different. And I have found a way become a better man, not a bitter man, based on the events that have happened to me that defined me in a positive way. And I remember the day my son died, after telling my wife, which was the worst thing I've ever done in my entire life, is to come home and say, honey, our son's dead. And after we got up from the floor, I thought, how am I going to tell my 2 boys that their older brother is dead? And I called my dad. My dad's a retired doctor. And I said, Dad, what do I say? My dad said, I'll tell you right now what to say. You tell them the truth and then you shut your mouth. And I thought to myself, okay, I like to talk. I'll tell the truth. So I got one of those down. And the boys came home. I sat them on the couch. And I swear to you, Jonathan, I did not rehearse this. I don't know where it came from. But I said, boys, your brother's dead. We went through the little thing where everyone got really sad and everything and so forth. And nonetheless, I said, we have 2 roads to go down. We have one road of anger, despair, and hatred, and we'll become alcoholics and addicts ourselves. Or we have a road of motivation and inspiration. This will be the greatest single event that'll happen in our lives and the lives of others around us. I'm on the second road. I ask you to join me. And the key part there, Jonathan, was I didn't want to tell them how to grieve. I wanted to show them how to grieve. I went straight freaking downhill, dude. Drank myself to death, considered possibly killing myself. This is like the first year after. So here I was showing strength immediately. I had a mask on in front of my boys, but I wasn't doing that because I didn't really know how. I knew how to say what I was going to do, but I didn't know how to do it. Do you follow? And so after a year of just figuring some things out, I got heavy into meditation, got heavy into reading, got heavy into writing, quit drinking. And everything, all of a sudden, my life started changing. I started realizing that there's a lot more ways out there to look at grief and trauma. And in Man's Search for Meaning, which I'm sure you've read, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, it's probably the greatest book I've ever read. I've read it at least 3 times. He said, suffering is my opportunity, and a light bulb went off. I remember where I was read it. I was at a pool reading it, and it hit me, and I shut the book, and you have those epiphany moments, which you probably have a lot of them. And I said, this is it. This is the sentence that. So I rephrased it, Jonathan. I came up with pain is unavoidable, but suffering is a choice. And so I have kind of learned that, it sucks. As far as I know, nobody's going to ever get off this planet without into death at some capacity, and someday I will, so will you. And we leave behind people that are going to have to learn to grieve. And in the meantime, before I die, people are going to die. So I'm going to have to learn how to find inspiration and honor the dead and live the living is another way I like to say it. So I was very attracted to trauma and grief. That was the big thing that really I wanted to get you on my show about, because I know most people probably want to talk to you about using psychedelics for PTSD and depression and anxiety, which is great, or maybe elevating to a spiritual plane, which is great. But I'm really interested in the trauma and grief therapy and how people can use this to become better people. But before I have you, maybe you've already covered a little bit of that. I'm also heavy into Stoicism, and I really believe that the mindset behind increasing our well-being, that we have more control over changing our lives. So what's your thoughts on how we can change negative behavior and maybe not avoid negative, because actually negative emotions can be great inspirations for great ideas, right? Envy and greed is a company up on. I was jealous that other people were doing better than me. I think imposter syndrome is a great thing. Somebody doing something better than you makes you get better. But then again, those negative habits, drinking, smoking, lying, stealing, those things can be the downfall of us. So what's your thoughts on that? And do you know much, or do you work much in the Stoicism arena as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I look at this work now to a great degree is it all starts in the mind, right? Like, my mother's working on her cancer. She's moved in with me about 6 months ago now. And, virtually all the work that we do together is mental and emotional work. And so, once we're able to clear the grief, once we're able to clear the traumas, and she's recently cleared stuff that took place when she was age 3 or 4 that she had again no normal conscious recollection of. So really it takes an expanded state to be able to access these things that the brain is, the ego itself is such a well architected and well-oiled defense mechanism, right? That's fundamentally what it's there for. It's to defend us. And so when we encounter grief or we encounter trauma, here's this really effective mechanism that just jumps into action to protect its owner from the thing. And so in theory, that's when it's working well, it's allowing you to continue through that day. But to the extent that that's actually optimizing for your long-term health is entirely a different question, right? And I think, there's so many aspects to this. If we talk about mind, body, heart, and spirit, grief and trauma takes hold in each of those kind of four areas, and has a real impact, right? So there's now some increasing science out there in terms of, let's just take the topic of epigenetics, right? Which is our gene expression. And, trauma and grief, absolutely. These are things that massively impact our genes if we don't process them accordingly. And so then the genetic expressions or the genetic misexpressions can manifest as disease, right? So it starts in the mind, then it manifests in our genetic expression, and then ultimately it manifests in some form of physical disease. Then we're on a very different path. And then, what we do with most of our trauma clients, and I would categorize grief within that, generally speaking, is it's really about emotional processing and emotional release. So what I'm talking about in relation to that is like getting really connected to our emotional body. I used to use my mind for these things and my body for those things, but the mind and body connection is so important. And so developing that connection so that we can actually release out these lower level energies is so fundamental to actually healing and being able to come back from grief and trauma.
So what's your thoughts? What do you think's the reason we are so unhappy as a society? And maybe just focus on the United States, maybe, because that's where I'm from, Iowa. And so I think you're from Maui, you said, right? You're from Hawaii?
Yeah.
Why are we so unhappy? We have all this great information out there. We have everything at our disposal, but we are miserable. The suicide rates are the highest they've ever been. Depression, anxiety, alcoholism, drug overdoses. When my son died, there was 56,000 Americans overdosed. There was 100,000 last year. And these people aren't just dying because they're curious and exploring. They're escaping from something. Why the hell are we so unhappy?
Yeah, so I think the best way to tell this story is to wind all the way back. So it's worth looking at, okay, who are the countries and who are the cultures that are alive and existing today, and why? And the unifying theme across them is, unfortunately, pretty much violence, right? So the most successful cultures are those who have colonized the world and who have, either successfully beat the neighboring countries or, very likely they've had to go to war or defend themselves through pretty serious stuff. So we've got a lot of intergenerational trauma that we're carrying, right? And so, kind of relating this to plant medicine for a second, if we look at how indigenous cultures do these medicine ceremonies, what they will typically do is they'll bring, 10 or 20 people together, they'll drink the medicine, and they'll clear whatever stuff has been going on within the community, right? Individually and collectively.
Right.
Now, for us, some of us maybe haven't cleared that stuff for 10, 20 generations because we've lost our wisdom traditions. We've lost our medicine traditions. When we hear about the people, the Salem, witch trials and stuff like that. That was effectively the loss of the medicine traditions. And not only that, but through history, colonialism has basically wiped out medicine traditions in all countries that colonialism could reach, and made all of these things illegal. So it's only, places deep in Africa, high in the Andes, deep in the Amazon, that these wisdom traditions have survived. And these are the cultures that are still connected, right? So the word that, if there was to be one word that comes to mind, it would be disconnection. And so trauma is disconnecting from ourselves. Then as a result of that, we've also become disconnected from our communities, right? And I think in the US at the moment, we're getting, pretty spectacular front row seats in the sense that, people just have lost a sense of community and a sense of shall we say, responsibility to the fellow man. Actually, there's a great podcast between Ezra Klein and Patrick Deneen. Patrick Deneen wrote this great book that was about why liberalism has failed, but what he actually is talking about is individualism. And in that, he talks about how on the left, people believe that, in essence, that the government should provide for the people. And on the right, we have a group of people who believes that the market decides who gets what. And that we believe that these are the two systems that are possible. And he says, what's interesting about that is that in both systems, you are removed from responsibility to your fellow man. And so we've just got this fundamental breakdown of the social fabric of communities, right? People don't feel connected to their community. They don't feel like they owe anything to their community. They don't want to contribute to their community. So the disconnection is from self. The disconnection as a result of that is to family and community. And then finally, disconnection from nature, right? I mean, we are doing things to the great mother, to the collective mother, that clearly no reliant organism would hope to do to their host unless they were parasitic. And so that begins to, raise questions in relation to the relationship that we have with Mother Nature, and the relationship, of course, that we want to foster, so that we can, live peaceably, and harmoniously, individually, as families, as communities, and as a human species in harmony with all the other species that also inhabit this beautiful planet.
That is so beautifully well said. I'm going to have to watch this a few times over and remember what you just said there. Disconnected. What a great word to pull out of this whole bucket of frustration and confusion. And I think that's so true. I mean, I think I look at the mask that we all run around on wearing. I know I did it for many years. We used to say, fake it till you make it in the business, and you probably heard that phrase. Yeah. And I did. I faked it till I don't know if I ever made it, but I've done quite well in the financial services industry to feel like I made it. But there is a disconnection. There's certainly a disconnection. And I speak to, and now that I've got a fairly decent social media, I get emails every day, people killing themselves. Look at Anthony Bourdain. Anthony Bourdain, and I just watched a Netflix documentary on him, and how sad and tragic it is for humans to lose a person like that did so much for so many. Yet he had these inner demons that he never found a way to resolve. But and then I look at I'm a heavy metal guy, as you can honestly tell. And I look at one of my favorite bands of all time, Metal Church. Their lead singer Mike Howe last year at 55 years old, and I just saw their concert. I saw him twice 2 years ago, and I'm baffled how this can happen. So I'm so happy that I get you on this show and talk about this, because I think there's a lot of people that are very, very interested in some of these ways we can move on. Put this all in the box and finish the last 20 or 30 minutes about this topic. I want to talk about that. When I started looking at ayahuasca, and I really had never even heard of ayahuasca until a couple of years ago, and I talked to a lot of people about possibly going on a retreat. I'm very interested in what you do, and possibly full disclosure, possibly using Behold retreats for my first experience. But I don't want to go from 0 to 100, right? I think that's a big risk for me to jump into this, from never doing this stuff to going on an ayahuasca retreat. But what's the sensitivity as somebody who is, very heavy into this, into the indigenous cultures, to respecting the shamanism, to the globalization of ayahuasca? And sometimes I've talked to people about this, and they're like, yeah, you're just another rich white Westerner wanting to run over to Peru and be saved. And I'm like, that's a good way to look at this. Maybe that is what I'm looking at doing. But am I looking at this the wrong way? For my first experience as being selfishly something to benefit me, and to maybe not respect the indigenous people? Because, as you said, with colonization, we have just come into some of these areas of the world and just removed the history and the legacy and the I don't know. There's something with me that's a little concerned about me going down this road. But I want to make sure I do it with the utmost respect to the shamans and to the indigenous people. So help me walk me through this.
Yeah, so you'll find this is a very interesting subject, because you'll find as many opinions on the subject as there are people, probably more opinions than there are people in the world. There's one of our medicine men. He's been doing this work for 30 years, and his maestro, who he apprenticed under, is 102 years old, indigenous, awesome. from an indigenous background, and I was recently speaking to him about this subject, and he said something that I love to repeat, because it struck me in a way that I found was interesting. And I don't necessarily entirely agree with what he said, but I respect the spirit in which he said it. He said, Jonathan, his name is also Jonathan, slightly confusingly, but he said, Jonathan, look, ayahuasca is a combination of two plants that when they come together and someone drinks it can really help someone. Anything over and above that is just humans getting in the way. Mm-hmm. And that really struck a chord with me, because he went on to say, like, look, there's 250 different traditions, and they brew the medicine, they use different vines, they brew the medicine in different ways, they have different additives. There's just so many traditions out there. And so when people, what he was trying to say is that when people say that this has to be kept in a particular container, he was saying, I don't necessarily see that. And that it also links a little bit to what I mentioned before, which is there's a culture, and there's a context, and there's a community under which these medicines were traditionally used, right? So these ancient wisdom traditions were always used within the context of community as a collective sort of experience. And then you would be returned, of course, to the community and the collective and that culture, following your experience. So there was a different container that you were coming from and going back into, relative to someone flying down from New York City and going for a week-long retreat and then flying back to New York City, right? And so the reason I share that is that, I personally think that there is a degree of especially for those people who are in privileged positions like you and I think there's reciprocity that we try to honor in two directions. The first is psychedelic harm in a generic context. So, we support Fireside Project, which is they're kind of like 911. Yeah, they do like 911 for psychedelic harm. All their services are free. So anyone who's having a bad trip because they've just gone and found something for $20 down the road and trying to do their own healing work themselves, it's a resource for them in their time of need. And the other one is indigenous reciprocity, right? And so we work with indigenous healers. Often these healers themselves have kind of removed themselves from their own communities. So you'll find as many other perspectives and ideas in relation to whether they're still members of these, the communities that they came from, or whether they're kind of out for themselves on a more commercial pursuit. But for me personally, I think of this as it's all a evolution and reflection of consciousness, and it's ultimately about self-determination and free will. And so I don't think that anyone needs to try to be too prescriptive in relation to how the work is done, how the medicine is brewed, and all of those sorts of things. I think that most people in this space are trying to do the best that they can. They're trying to honor the people, they're trying to honor the land, they're trying to honor the wisdom traditions. The variety of quality of work in this space is staggering. I always encourage people, I say, go look at any retreat aggregator, you'll see it's all 5 stars. That doesn't reflect my experience. And so I think it's important that there is reciprocity to people who aren't in positions of privilege. I think it's important that there is reciprocity to indigenous groups and cultures. And but exactly how that takes shape, I think, should be at the behest of each retreat center or each organization, and then people can self-select into what resonates with them individually.
The autonomy is so important in addiction and substance abuse, and not battling being dependent on developing autonomous skills. And so I really like that answer that you talked about in regards to the indigenous people. And I see a very interesting dynamic in regards to trying to protect their integrity, and then capitalism, filtering in and actually probably changing the many of these people in these indigenous areas, to the point where they're probably saying, hey, this can be a business. This can be new money into our economy. And that's, again, I know capitalism is death nail to a lot of people on one side of the fence. But again, I don't live in these indigenous areas, and I don't know what it's like to have to work for food. And I don't know what it's like to have an opportunity like this presented where I could use a skill of maybe being a shaman, but at the same time, feed my family and increase the well-being of my community. So I do think there's, like you said, you talked about the polar opposites, the liberals and conservatives. It's either or, and that's kind of how Americans live in this society. And that's why this disconnect angle, I'm really going to do more. Do you have a book? Yeah, I want to know if you have a book, because I some of the things you said I've been writing down, but I was curious if you've ever written a book about your journey and about some of the thoughts and ideas that you have, because I think Disconnected would be a whole book you could write about the disconnection that we have with social media and politics and all these things, especially in the United States. I don't know where that came. I just thought about if you had a book.
Yeah, I've been meaning to get around to it. I haven't started it yet. I've got.
Well, you should. You should have a book.
Oh, thank you. Too kind.
Okay, so talk a little bit about the indigenous people. That was important to me. So let's talk a little bit about the Fireside Project and about your Behold retreats, and kind of end the show on a little bit more specifically about you, your business model. What is an ayahuasca retreat? Maybe in 5 minutes. I get on a plane, I fly over there. What the heck happens all the way in between? And it seems to me, based on your website, that there's a setup time, that you just don't get on a plane, writing a check and go over there and get fixed. There's some pre-op that we have, before the operation, and maybe talk a little bit about that, so the person like me that's very naive on this can get a really full, immerse ourselves into the journey, and help us through what to expect on some type of an ayahuasca retreat.
Yeah, so the way I very much look at this work now is that it's 80% mental and emotional work, which is what sets up the 20% with plant medicine to be as effective and transformational as it can be. So, in essence, Behold Retreats was really born out of my own experience, my own motivations, my own mistakes over quite a number of years in attending a bunch of 5-star retreats. And I realized that, my first retreats, I wasn't well prepared. I didn't really know what I was trying to do. And I didn't really, I just really didn't understand the depth of the work or what good looked like. And so, I started thinking, obviously friends started coming to me and asking me questions about, my experiences, and they could see the shift in me that was taking place. And so then that motivated me to, first it started with a bit of a document in terms of, okay, here's my experience, here's what to look out for. Then it turned into hosting a retreat for friends. And then I realized, okay, I really want to be able to invite close friends and people in my network into really high quality experiences. And so once I started working with some private healers, I recognized that the difference in quality between my first 3.5 years of journeys at various 5-star retreat centers versus the realm of the possible were just on two completely different dimensions. And so that really redoubled my motivations. And I'm like, okay, there's really something else here. And so what we try to do for our clients is really help them get clear on future self, right? I truly believe that anyone can become whoever it is that they want to be. None of us has any real limits. It's just, false limiting beliefs that need to be moved out of the way. So we help our clients get really clear on their future selves, number one. Second to that, we really work with them to surface the mental and emotional blind spots, right? So what is it that's keeping you from being that person today? And so that's when all the lower level stuff comes in. That's when the negative patterns of mind and the limiting beliefs come in. So they'll work with one of our coaches, one of our therapists, depending on where they're at and what they're working on, to really dig deep in terms of, being able to surface those things and ultimately release those things. And then the last thing is we teach them tools. So, I mentioned emotional release, emotional processing before. In terms of working with medicine, that's so important. There's a saying in our industry, you can't heal what you won't feel. And so we have to go looking in those dark places that we don't want to look. And we actually need to feel those emotions. We need to release those emotions. And for many of us, we've spent most of our lives avoiding feeling those emotions. And so we always try to make sure that our clients have those tools leading into the medicine work, because the way I look at these plants is the medicine's trying to harmonize mind, body, heart, and spirit to a single vibration. And once it's been able to achieve that, then it's moving your body up, it's moving yourself, your being up into a higher vibration. And what that does is it then amplifies some of the dissonant lower level energies. And so that can amplify the pain, the shame, the guilt, the fear, the trauma, all of those sorts of things. And so if we don't know how to release that in that moment of amplification, then it can become even more frightening, because we're trying to lead away from the experience. And then it becomes, what is often referred to as a bad trip, because we're just not accepting the experience for what it is.
Do you think a lot, Jonathan, are just a false set of expectations? I know when I talk to people about meditation, they say, "Oh, I tried it, nothing happened." And I'm like, well, okay, you just kind of described meditation what it is. It's like your expectations are something's going to happen. So do you think that here's Jeff Johnston flying out to, I places, you have Mexico, Costa Rica, Peru, Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain. If I flew out to the Netherlands to go on an ayahuasca retreat, you think my expectations will be out of whack?
It's a good question, and I think it's important that people don't have too much in the way of expectations. It's good that people educate themselves. I always encourage our clients to educate themselves specifically on the more challenging experiences that can arise, because as this space is increasingly commercialized, then you can certainly see that there's an amplification. Even the media, right? Even celebrities, you can see are amplifying the good and, shall we say, downplaying the challenging. Right. So we had a journalist actually recently join us at, she did a psilocybin retreat in the Netherlands, and she had a really challenging experience. And so she jumped back on a call with me yesterday, actually, and she was like, she was expecting me to be defensive in relation to the story that she felt called to write. And I was saying, no, I absolutely respect and honor the fact that you are going to write a story that is going to bring more nuance to the conversation, because the reality is that my first experience, I threw up 150 times and I passed out 10 times. I was truly underprepared and not well cared for on the spiritual plane, and I was terrified. And so I think it's important that people recognize the depths and the potential challenges of this work ahead of jumping on a plane and putting themselves through it. The other aspect is really taking the time and energy individually to develop our own why, right? So it's tempting. We hear about something that is framed as good or helpful, and we think, oh well, I like things that are good. I like things that are helpful. I'm going to go do this. But it's very important to anchor very deeply to our own motivation, our own intention, because that's something that is so powerful in that moment where things are becoming really challenging, to be able to focus our mind back on that core intentionality and to help us navigate some of the more challenging aspects of a journey.
It's interesting you say that, because someone asked me the other day, why would you want to do this? And I struggled in an answer. I think curiosity, exploration, adding another arrow to my quiver, a tool to the toolbox, so to speak. Okay, so let me ask you, what is the best way for people to follow you, to reach out to you, to inquire about not just Behold Retreats, but I love the Fireside Project. I was on your website quite a bit last night reading about it, and I think that's an awesome aspect adding to this journey that you're on. And I think people like me that are completely naive on this topic, there's a benefit to being naive, right? Because you're open-minded, and I don't have an agenda. I didn't put you on the show to grill you about anything. I put you on the show selfishly to learn more about what you do, and hopefully in so I can present this in a open-minded tone to my followers and my future followers. Anyway, what's the best way to reach you, I guess? And then I have another kind of wrap this up for you. I know it's getting late there where you are. But how do people follow you and reach you? And if people have some questions to ask you in regards to personal, becoming a client of what you do?
Yeah, you can find us on Instagram at behold_retreats, or you can find us online at www.behold-retreats.com. For us, there's no book now button on our website. You got to speak to a real person. So invite all of our clients to fill out an application form. Then either me or one of my team will be in touch, and we'll talk through where you're at and what you'd like to gain from experience, and help you understand whether you want to join one of our small groups, or, as I often recommend to people, if you're in a position to do so, consider doing the work privately, because it's a very different type of experience.
So I notice nothing in here on your site says anything about the United States. Is that simply because this stuff isn't legal here? Is that, and you have some pushback in that area? And do you see the United States, you having facilities to do retreats here?
Yeah, so there is a small subset of legal retreat centers that do operate in the U.S. They do so under what's called the Religious Freedom Rights Act, and so they're operating under some, typically it's an indigenous church sort of a context. Sure. A lot of the leading practitioners, as you might imagine, don't want to be in a compromised sort of situation. They don't want to be, given the nature of the work, they don't want to be looking over their shoulders. And so that's why a lot of them are in Costa Rica or Mexico, Peru, because that's where the work is legal. So, yeah, I think there's a lot happening in terms of decriminalization, legalization, and medicalization. As you might imagine, there's forces at work that are very eager to patent and medicalize and control these medicines because they are so powerful and effective. I don't personally see that being the model that's in the interests of the greatest human good. I still think that any compromises of that sort that are required in order to fit the square peg into the round hole and to get this treatment available to more people is absolutely compromises being made. But the right things will evolve. There is higher order here that is underway, and the plants are facilitating and architecting that in ways that even the most advanced spiritual mystics and healers are still doing their best to understand. So I always place great faith in that and our collective evolution.
Well, I love your outlook on everything, and this has been an awesome hour. And I have last thing I'm going to ask a favor of you. About 6 months ago, foot RV. And I am traveling on May 9th. I'm going on the Living Undeterred U.S. tour, and I'm going on an RV for 95 days to every state. I'm raising $1 million for mental health, substance abuse, and addiction. I'm about 5 in my driveway. I have 17 states already committed to work with me. Now, I know you don't have the United States, boots on the ground facilities as of yet, but I'm so interested you do at some capacity that I would invite you at some point to be involved on this as a research project to help Americans, to help the world change the narrative of mental health, substance abuse, and addiction. And I'm just a little overwhelmed conversation today, and my mind is spinning that I'm going to be doing so much reading and more research on this. But I wanted to personally invite you as to at some capacity partake on this journey with me. Again, on 95 days, we have a lot of sponsorship, corporate sponsorship, and this is an area that I think has tremendous amount of upside. Full disclosure, I own some stocks in companies that invest in this area. So I personally see this as an area that has potential for people to be putting capital in into building equity in their own portfolios. I think it's an untapped market. So I admire what you're doing as a business owner. I have slight imposter syndrome with you. I'm like, and I love what you do. But again, thanks so much, Jonathan. I'm super excited to have this opportunity to talk with you. Do you have any last closing remarks you'd like to say to my listeners on anything that we've talked about today?
No, yeah, I'd love to know how I can support your mission. It sounds beautiful. I love what you're doing, and I love that you're walking the talk, which is amazing, or rolling across all 50 states of or the 48 anyway. So I love that. The last thing I'd love to say is, look, obviously we focused in on plant medicine and psychedelics, but ultimately I think the big opportunity for all of us is to give primacy to what's going on in our inner world. So whether it's through meditation, which you've already spoken about, whether it's through breath work, contemplative practices, prayer, whatever traditions, religions resonate with you, all the scriptures, if they've got all the right messages, and these are the same messages that come from the plants. Often, there's been different interpretations of different things, but like just harmonizing our inner world to a single vibration, and then lifting that vibration is by far the most important contribution that any of us can make for ourselves, and indeed for the rest of the people around us and humanity as a whole. So just find some time and some energy to dedicate to your inner world.
Well, listen, I love you like a brother, man. I just met you. Good luck to your mom. It's admirable what you're doing. I think that's awesome. I just lost my mom a month ago, 89 years old. Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. I watched my dad take care of her to her last breath, and I got so much respect for people that put themselves in those positions and step up to the plate and help our family. Anyway, man, thanks a lot so much. I'm sure our paths will cross many times down the road. Thanks again for being a guest on the Living Undeterred podcast, and best of luck with all you do.